what I feel. In the last several days, I've been feeling like I'm in a surreal space. Surreal.
Mm.
And it's somewhat a nightmare from the fascist shit show, the fascist demo shit show. But it's now looking to me like this conflict with Persia and the Red Sea and the Suez Canal and Israel and Gaza. It's almost looking choreographed in order to capture attention, in order to facilitate war funding, and to maybe acclimate the people toward a potentially wider war if it gets out of control. And I do not know if we're going to get out of control, but I've been saying a long time that a lid is on this for getting much, much worse and going global and turning into a conflagration, which is a general term for meaning more retaliatory strikes and retaliatory strikes of a nuclear nature. And I do believe that we had, several years ago, we had some experimental micro nukes exploded in Ukraine. I believe the US and NATO side did them. They were micro nukes. And this is really quite interesting. I won't go on long, but I just want to make an interesting point that if you have a very big explosion, it's pretty hard to argue that it's a conventional type of detonation. And I remember reading an article that was fascinating. It must have been about 2018 or so, maybe 17. I think they were doing experimental micro nukes, and they actually proved that they were micro nukes by the level of whiteness in the white for the explosion. Nuclear is the whitest of the white. I know that sounds a little strange to people who aren't too familiar with color recognition, but just think of, you got several shades of gray working toward black. Well, black, you could say, has some shades in itself, and so does white. And they have measurements for the white that machines do the detection for. And what they concluded was, way back 7 years ago or so, they had micro nukes in Ukraine from the level of whiteness. It's fascinating to examine some of the technological features, but I think we're being lied to. Now, we made a point before we began recording. I made a simple question. When was the last time we got a true story from the Western mainstream news about Ukraine and the status there? Whether it was pushing back the Russians, or casualties for the Russians, or casualties for the Ukrainians, or the type of conscription, meaning who are they drafting for the Ukraine army, or damage to Ukrainian bunkers and headquarters centers for the NATO. I believe we've been lied to well over 90% of the time regarding Ukraine. And, this is not unique, because we're lied to about the US economy. And, I got to tell you, Patrick, this is my 20th anniversary month. I now have 240 months. It was April of 2004 that I began this at the age of 52. And now here, 20 years later, I'm having trouble adding 52 and 20, but maybe you can help me with that later.
45.
Anyway, now I'm 62. I think it's 60. Anyway, I'm collecting Social Security, but I'm spry. I'm alert. I got a lot of energy, and I won't even tell you what I did this afternoon just to make sure I didn't take a taxi. Okay, we're being lied to. In the first year, in the first several months in 2004, I cut my teeth on talking about how the government officials and the mainstream news were lying about economic statistics. And the three biggies are price inflation, jobless rate, and the gross domestic product economic growth. I pointed to shadow government statistics and the pre-Clinton CPI, which was at that time about 5% higher than what was reported in the mainstream news, which meant that the economic growth was 5% lower. And we were stuck in a recession for many years in the early years of this newsletter. Okay, I learned very quickly. I mean, honestly, you got to go back. I was in high school during the Vietnam War. When I graduated from high school, I was 1 year away from the draft. I graduated at age 17. So I was 1 year away from the draft. So I followed what was going on when I was a junior and a senior in high school, because I didn't want to enter a meat grinder. And I learned how many lies we were told about Vietnam. You weren't even born then. And I was learning that MSM News was full of lies. And I won't get into the lies, but some of the biggest ones were, we're trying to fight communism, trying to curb their growth. We don't want to, and there were some items in there that were so blatant that there wasn't even a lie. They weren't permitted to blow up Sam City, the surface to air missiles, SAM. There was a place in North Vietnam, we could not bomb them. It's so that we could sustain and have a good, long war. Okay, I actually met a guy during a summer vacation sitting on the side at Lake Chautauqua in central New York. And the neighbor had a son, and he was 24, and he just got back from a Vietnam tour. And we talked for 3 hours. Okay, I learned a lot about the lies. So by the time I got to graduate school, in the late 20s, mid 20s, I was well acclimated to the lies. And then we were lied to about why are we outsourcing our industry? It was so that we could wreck the US economy. This is so simple. They told the public that it was for lower cost of labor, lower regulations for pollution, and just general good, solid production on the Pacific Rim. Well, no, it was to eliminate the legitimate income for the US economy. And we got Black Monday in October of '87 as a consequence of that. And it was a little earlier than what I expected. In '84, I said, we got about 4 or 5 years, and we're going to have a crash, something with debt. Okay, you go on to that, from that, and fast forward, and you get irrational exuberance in the mid '90s from Sir Alan, Knight of England, working for the Crown. He never worked for the United States. He worked for the Crown. Okay, move on forward to 9/11, which is just an enormous pack of lies. And from there, you go on to the Lehman Brothers incident, which is another pack of lies. And the trigger for that, by the way, was Chinese sold Fannie Mae bonds. They triggered that. Okay, move on from there to ZIRP, zero interest rate. Why do we do that? Well, to lower our borrowing costs, so we could have really Ponzi-like growth in our debt. And go on, move on forward. Why do we have quantitative easing? Well, we don't want to call it hypermonetary inflation, from unsterilized monetization of our debt. So let's call it QE, quantitative easing, and let's do a little Keynesian holy water on that.
Mm-hmm.
From there, we went to Ukraine. We went to the fake pandemic. We went to the war that got provoked. Okay, I'm giving you a 50-year quick synopsis of lies by mainstream news. So when they said that not a single hit in Israel was caused by the Iranian airstrikes last week, I say, well, it's probably bullshit. We'll get the real story soon enough. And what I heard was that the Nevatim Air Force Base in the third round was very severely damaged by hypersonic missiles. Did the mainstream news even mention hypersonic missiles? I don't think so. Okay, what I learned is that there were 3 rounds for the assault. I call it Persia, it's Iran, same thing. My clients tell me, call it Persia, Jim, come on. It's the name that they've had for 5,000 years, so don't go with Iran. Anyway, it's the same thing. The first round were the slow-moving drones. And they move like 100 miles an hour, or maybe less, or maybe a little bit more. And they're not hard to knock down. Okay, so some of the air defense arsenal was used up. I won't say exhausted, but used up. And then the second round, they had the slower missiles. And we just checked this. The cruise missiles are 500 miles an hour. That's pretty darn fast, but they're subsonic.
Mm-hmm.
And in that second round, more of the air defenses were knocked, what do you call it? More of the air defenses were successful, like they were with the drones in round one, but they used up and somewhat depleted the Israeli air defense. And they were not ready for round three, and it caused severe damage at the Nevatim Air Force Base, where there were some independent reports of 44 Air Force officers were killed. And that Nevatim Air Force Base was noted as being the headquarters for doing some of the planning, like on the Syrian embassy for Iran, the Persians. So they targeted the Nevatim and they hit it. And apparently, you know, we'll probably never know unless we get some reports from, I hate to say this, from non-Western sources. Our Western press told us that the election was fair and that none of the mail-in ballots were improper. Okay, we have, what I do, and this is really simple. I take the mainstream news, I completely turn it around, and that's what I start with.
Yep.
And maybe it's a little bit deviated from that, maybe not much. But when I see Alberta firemen uniforms from Canada in Ukraine, I know they're lying about the photos. And when I see dead Ukrainians or huddled masses of Ukrainians, and it's the same exact picture used in Syria 3 years before, I know they're lying to us about Ukraine. So I expect that they're lying to us about Gaza, and they're lying to us about civilian deaths in Gaza. Okay, we're lied to by our own press. Okay, now let's move on to the retaliatory strike by the Israelis in Persia.
Okay.
I have a Persian client. I've known him for a good 8 or 9 years. He's been a client a long time, and he's a very bright guy. And what I found his strengths to be is international information and implications, geopolitical analysis, and some of the major factors at work.
Okay.
And he said, Jim, I'm Persian. I've got cousins. I've got friends in Persia. And not a single missile struck the land of Persia. Not a single one. And I wrote back and said, yeah, there's a lot of talk about explosions. And he said, yeah, those are midair.
So no actual.
We're lied to about mostly everything. What's that?
I said, so no actual damage on the ground, just overhead aerial explosions to simulate it.
That's what I'm hearing. And apparently the air defenses were very good. And I do not know if any of the air defenses knocked down a supersonic missile. I don't know whether Israel launched any supersonic missile. Okay, that is a different level of warfare. And I believe that what took out, I'm not certain about this, but I believe what took out the Nevatim Air Force Base in Israel was Persian supersonics. Okay, there's different levels of supersonic. The Russians have like, okay, Mach 1 means the speed of sound. That's about 730 miles an hour, something like that. If that's not it exactly, it's very close. The airlines, commercial airlines, are always under 700 miles an hour. They don't want to get anywhere near sonic boom territory. But the Russians have supersonic that's like Mach 5. And there's no defense. And that's what they're threatening in the NATO nations if they launch F-35s or F-17s to do strikes in Russia, that's going to be legitimate target territory. Okay, back to this point. My Persian client, and I'm looking for a different Persian client to confirm things. I don't have like 10 or 12 of them. They're hard to come by. I have two, and I feel quite fortunate in having two because one of them has family and friends. He said, Jim, I speak your language. I call them up every week or two. I call up friends, find out what's going on. Okay. This is
very interesting.
Very standard stuff. And, he was very emphatic. He said not a single one hit the ground in Persia in the last few days. But, some might. We don't know. We don't have a visual of this. We don't see. Okay, by the way, when a cruise missile comes in, you don't see it. When was the last time you saw a 500-mile-an-hour movement? Okay, we can see an aircraft, a commercial aircraft going 520 because it's way up there. But when a missile is coming down, they're not very big and they move really fast. So you don't really see it. What you get is a streak. Okay, there's going to be a lot more to this, and I'm hoping that we don't get action, counterattack, another attack, counterattack, because this is what the US, UK, NATO axis, I call it the fascist axis. And, people better wake up to the music here because our United States nation has been taken over by a group that is installing fascism and calling it democracy. Their version of democracy fits every definition of fascism.
Yep.
We got censorship, we got fraud, we got usage of the courts to attack and isolate and hamstring political opponents, just like Nicaragua.
Absolutely.
Really embarrassing for the United States. We're considered a bit of a joke now to the entire global community. Now, I don't know where you want to go with this, but we got to mention something regarding the Red Sea.
Sure. Go ahead. Go ahead. This was the first topic that I wanted to get into, and you already covered most of my questions. So yeah, talk about the Red Sea.
I made a call back in February. I said that obstruction to the Red Sea is going to bring about a U.S. government debt default and a depression in the United States. And what we're seeing is any nation that's part of the US, UK, NATO axis, and that includes, Western Europe, they're getting their ships blocked. And some are bold enough to test the Houthis. And some people who don't know jack shit think that the Houthis are a bunch of ragheads who are operating with 18th century warfare with blunderbusses and other nonsense.
No.
When they've got some really decent arsenals of Persian weapons.
That's right.
And notice that 2 years ago, we started seeing a lot of drones that Russia purchased from the Persians. And the Persians have rather sophisticated drones. They have what they call tank killers. They fly around, gather intel, isolate the tanks, and then take them out. And they got 3, 4, 6 missiles per drone, the big ones. The Russians have been, in a sense, doing alpha testing, not beta. Beta is where, you have a very isolated group and you keep it all quiet and private. Now, this is alpha testing, open warfare. And what I'm reading, what I learned, not from any Western source, because it's 90% bullshit and opposite, is that the drone technology from Persia is pretty good. I don't know that it is equal to the United States drone warfare, but it might be close. But it's certainly effective enough to take out tanks in 30 days. Now, I have a joke regarding the Germans. The Germans are upset that they don't have enough natural gas supplied by Russia in order to make weapons and trucks and tanks and half-tracks. The Germans don't have enough natural gas to make these weapons that they could send to Ukraine and the Russians would knock out in 30 days. Okay, this is how stupid the war has gotten. And the Germans have arrived at a conclusion that they don't want to play the game anymore of sending Leopard tanks that get knocked out in 30 days.
That's right.
From drones. Okay, we're in asymmetric warfare. A drone is not a really big expense, but if it can knock out 6 or 8 tanks, you've got a big multiple of the payoff for a rather moderate cost. And the ragtag Houthis have, I featured this in the January report, I believe. There was an underwater drone recon device. It did not send out, launch a torpedo. It went underwater to gather intel on ships in the Red Sea.
Wow.
And then it probably, heads back home and relays the data. And before you know it, you get a drone attack and they know exactly where the targets are. Okay, this is Persian